Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, The Cyclins. Have you ever felt that human behavior is too complicated to be understood only through numbers, experiments, and laboratory studies? Imagine this situation. A student scores low in exams. Now, one psychologist says, let's measure his IQ. Another says, let's observe his study habits. Another record reaction time, memory span, attention level, and motivation scores. But what about the student's fear, family pressure, loneliness, identity crisis, and emotional pain? Can every human experience really be reduced to laboratory data? And this exact question created what psychologists later called the crisis in psychology. So, in today's video, we are going to understand what is the experimental analytical paradigm, what is logical empiricism, why did psychology face a crisis, why did many psychologists start criticizing traditional scientific methods, and how did this crisis change modern psychology forever? Trust me, once you understand this topic in simple language, it becomes one of the easiest and most interesting concepts in Unit 1. And at the end of the video, I'll also give you some UGC NET style memory tricks and examples that will make revision super easy. So let's begin. When psychology first emerged as a science, psychologists desperately wanted society to accept psychology as a real science, just like physics or chemistry. Think about it carefully. Physics studies measurable things like speed, force, gravity, and energy. Chemistry studies measurable reactions and substances. These sciences looked very objective and precise, so early psychologists thought if psychology also wants respect as a science, we must use the same scientific methods. And because of this, psychology became heavily dependent on laboratory experiments, measurements, statistics, observation, control conditions, and objective data. This approach became known as the experimental analytical paradigm. Now, don't get scared by the term. It sounds difficult, but it is actually simple. Let's break it. Experimental means studying behavior through experiments. For example, testing memory in a lab, measuring reaction time, studying learning using rewards and punishments, observing rats pressing levers. Analytical means breaking complex behavior into smaller measurable parts. For example, instead of studying love as a whole emotion, psychologists try to measure attraction, attachment, emotional dependence, physiological arousal. So basically, psychologists started treating human beings almost like scientific objects that could be measured and analyzed. And this way of thinking became strongly connected with something called logical empiricism. Now, what is this logical empiricism? Again, let's simplify it. Logical empiricism says only that knowledge is scientific which can be observed, measured, verified, and tested. In simple words, if you cannot measure it scientifically, then it is not proper scientific knowledge. This idea influenced psychology deeply, so psychologists started focusing only on observable behavior, measurable data, experiments, statistics, and objectivity. And they started avoiding things like emotions, meaning of life, subjective experiences, consciousness, spirituality, and personal feelings, because these things were difficult to measure scientifically. Now comes the most important part. Psychology became so obsessed with being scientific that it slowly started ignoring actual human experience, and this created dissatisfaction among many psychologists. Why? Because humans are not robots. Let's take a simple example. Suppose a person is crying after losing a loved one. Now imagine one psychologist says heart rate increased, stress hormones elevated, sleep cycle disturbed. Technically, these measurements are correct. But do these numbers fully explain grief? No. The emotional pain, memories, attachment, and meaning behind the loss cannot be fully captured in laboratory measurements, and this became the central criticism. Psychology was becoming too mechanical and reductionist. One major issue was reductionism. Reductionism means reducing complex human experiences into small measurable units. For example, reducing love into hormones, reducing intelligence into IQ scores, reducing depression into neurotransmitter imbalance, reducing personality into test scores. Critics argued that this approach ignores the richness of human life. Human beings are influenced by culture, emotions, relationships, values, personal meaning, society, history, and consciousness, and these cannot always be understood through controlled experiments alone. Another criticism was that laboratory studies often created artificial situations. Imagine this: a participant enters a psychology lab. He knows he is being observed. He sits in front of computers and instruments. Now ask yourself, will he behave naturally? Probably not. Real life is messy and emotional, but laboratory experiments often remove real life complexity in order to maintain control. So critics said psychology is studying behavior in artificial settings and then generalizing it to the real life. That became a serious issue. One school that strongly reflected logical empiricism was behaviorism. Behaviorists believed psychology should study only observable behavior. People like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner argued that thoughts and feelings are too subjective to study scientifically. So behaviorists focused mainly on stimulus, response, reinforcement, conditioning. For example, if a rat presses a lever and gets food, the behavior increases. But critics asked, can humans really be understood only through stimulus response mechanisms? What about creativity, dreams, emotions, free will, and personal meaning? These questions became because of dissatisfaction with strict scientific approaches, a new movement emerged called humanistic psychology. Psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers argued that psychology had forgotten the human side of humans. They said psychology should study personal growth, self-awareness, emotions, freedom, meaning, creativity, and subjective experiences. For example, if a student fails an exam, humanistic psychologists would ask, how does the student feel? What meaning does failure have for them? How does it affect self-esteem? This was very different from purely experimental approaches. Another criticism came from phenomenological thinkers. They argued to understand human beings, we must understand how people experience the world. For example, two people may experience the same event differently. Imagine heavy rain. One farmer may feel happiness because crops will grow. Another traveler may feel frustration because roads are blocked. Same event, different subjective experiences. But experimental psychology often ignored these personal meanings, and critics believe this made psychology incomplete. Another major issue was called the crisis of relevance. Many psychologists started asking, is psychology helping real human problems? Researchers were producing highly technical experiments, complicated statistics, and laboratory findings, but ordinary people were struggling with stress, trauma, social inequality, identity issue, loneliness, and unemployment. Critics argued that psychology was becoming disconnected from real society. It was becoming scientifically impressive but socially less meaningful. The crisis happened because psychology focused too much on objectivity, measurement, experiments, and statistics, and too little on human experience, meaning, emotions, consciousness, and social context. That is the heart of this topic. Now, this is important. Critics were not saying experiments are useless. Experiments are extremely valuable. Without scientific methods, therapies cannot be tested, medicines cannot be evaluated, learning cannot be studied properly. The real issue was overdependence. Psychology became too narrow. Critics wanted psychology to become more balanced, meaning use scientific methods but also understand subjective human experience. This crisis actually helped psychology grow. Because of criticism, psychology later became more open to qualitative research, cognitive psychology, humanistic psychology, social constructionism, cultural psychology, positive psychology, and existential psychology. Researchers started realizing that human behavior must be understood from multiple perspectives. Today, modern psychology uses both quantitative methods and qualitative understanding. So, the crisis actually expanded psychology. Remember this simple formula: too much science plus too little humanity gives in crisis in psychology, or even simpler, humans are more than numbers. That single sentence summarizes the entire topic beautifully. So in today's video, we understood that psychology faced a crisis because it became too dependent on the experimental analytical paradigm and logical empiricism. Psychologists focused heavily on measurement, objectivity, laboratory experiments, observable behavior, while often ignoring emotions, consciousness, subjective experiences, meaning, culture, and real life human complexity. This led many psychologists to criticize traditional approaches and demand a more human-centered psychology, and that criticism eventually helped psychology become broader, richer, and more balanced. If this explanation made the topic simple for you, then make sure to revise it once again in your own words, because Unit 1 concepts become very easy when you understand the logic behind them instead of mugging up definitions. Also, don't leave immediately after the video. Try solving practice questions right away, because that is where real UGC NET preparation begins. I will give the practice questions in the description below, so go through it. If you want more simple and detailed UGC NET psychology lectures with examples and easy explanations, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.